section. You were talking about your growing up years, and I'd like you to talk about your early beginnings as a writer. Could you talk about how your personal history of growing up in Edenton, Georgia, in the apartheid South, has shaped your writing and your activism?
Well, I grew up not in the little town of Edenton, but actually in Putnam County, which is just, way out in the most exquisite countryside that you can imagine, with streams and trees and pastures and cattle. And what was difficult was that we had terrible housing, and of course the apartheid system, USA segregation, was really horrible, because what it meant was that the white people had everything, basically the power. They controlled the military, they controlled the economy. People like my parents had to work as sharecroppers, which meant that every year they could be forced out of the little shack that they had. So that was very difficult. But that was a foundation for me to understanding exploitation and poverty wherever I see it. I cannot be fooled. And this is so good, because it's amazing how much stuff you can cut through when you understand from childhood what it is you're seeing. And many people don't have that. They will look at poverty and they will think, oh, well, down there in, I don't know, Honduras, and down there in Mexico, and down there in the ghetto, wherever that is, they don't have shoes, but they just seem so fine, and they don't have enough to eat, but they don't seem to need much. So I was saved from that.
That's an important vision. So you suggested the poet-writer as activist as the title for your talk. And there's been this long-standing bias in particularly American literature against the political in art. So I'm wondering, your vision is a political vision, and I'm wondering if you always thought of your writing...
Wait. We have to discuss why they don't want you to have a political vision in your art.
Right.
They don't want you to have a political vision in your art for the same reason they don't want you to move into their neighborhoods. Because you will see what they have stolen. That's why. So again, once you understand that, why shouldn't you be political? And I think politics is only life. I mean, it's only how usually Howard Zinn and I used to have this conversation where he would like to call them they, and I would say, no, we have to find a really good word for them. We can't just call them they. And he said, well, I think we can just call them they. And we ended up with him continuing to call them they, and I decided that no, I'm too much of a poet to call them they. It's so vague. I prefer thieves.
Given your political vision, were there particular writers that influenced you in that regard?
Tolstoy, way back there in those back hills of Georgia, I'm telling you. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gorky, when I got to Spelman and studied with Howard. And I don't know, I was very fortunate. My teachers understood that I loved to read, and they gave me books. And I was always drawn to the stories about people being misjudged and abused and overcoming, somehow landing on their feet, like Jean Valjean, whom I adored with all my heart. So literature and in poetry, in our little shack we had a copy of a big, thick book called Prose and Poetry. And my sister, who had gone to college years before I was 6 or something, she was twice my age, but she had come back and she would read to us and tell us stories. So it seemed quite natural and normal to begin to understand that if you have a craft, and if you work at your craft, and if you give it your complete heart, and you also love people, and I did, I love my people, my family, my parents and my grandparents. I loved them so much as a little child that I don't know how I survived it. I would just feel so much love for them. It was like, I don't know. I mean, I think we should talk more to children about how they feel love. I think we don't know. I think we've forgotten ourselves often. And I think we don't realize the passion with which very young children can love adults and look up to them. So I had all of that, to use to make poetry. I started writing poetry when I was 10 or so. And I have a notebook. I just gave all of my things to Emory University, and there's my first scrapbook when I was 15. And it has a long list of people that it's dedicated to, and it's so interesting because I dedicated it first to myself.
How old were you?
15.
15. So you were talking about a little bit about your writing craft and process, and when you talk about it, when I read your work, I think of it as kind of a dance between the communal, the taking stories from the world, from ancestors, and then the very solitary effort of your imaginative world and your craft. Can you expand a little bit on what that is like for you, and if your process has changed over time?
Well, I don't know. It changes. But what I think it is it's the being that is me, saying to the ancestors, saying to the community, the relatives, the friends, the lovers, the dogs, whoever, that I just absolutely adore you. I just love you so much. But you know what? I am going to remain me. And so that is the tension. Because I think especially for women, there's actually a book called Women Who Love Too Much. I'm not like that. So I think there is that tension though, where you recognize in yourself a loving spirit. One of the faults that was found with me when I was growing up was that I would give away anything. I just didn't see the point in not doing that, and they had to really sit me down a few times. But at some point, you do get it, that you can give, but you must always keep enough to be you, and that is the medicine that is often needed by your community, that you are you.
A lot of your work is about that self-love, self-care, and how important that is as an aspect of feeling empathy in the world and compassion and going out to change the world. Can you talk about that sort of dance between self-change and changing the world?
Well, what I need is retreat. And I grew up in a place where you weren't allowed in the hotels and you couldn't buy anything actually because they wanted to keep us poor. So for me, I have had to find ways to usually buy a retreat so that I can have a place that's safe and that they'd have a hard time making me move out of. So there's that kind of tension of finding solitude when I need it, a place that is in nature, because I love the natural world so much, and it's torture really to see what is happening to it and has been happening to it for 400 or 500 years. And there is this grieving always about its beauty and its desecration, because we are sustained by it. This is something that seems so foreign to the settlers. here rather than the indigenous who understood that we are literally one with it, and everything, as Chief Seattle said so beautifully, everything that is done, we do to the earth, we do to ourselves, and we see where this is leading. We see where we're headed, and we're already there. So it's a matter of finding a space. It's a matter of finding companions and compañeros and people who understand, that politics is, is part of living, is part of understanding how you move a society, that you can't. I mean, you could write poetry, and I often do actually, just about, trees and flowers and, I love the wind. And in fact, one of my favorite poems is this Taoist poem, Spring Comes and the Grass Grows by Itself. This is absolutely perfect. This is a perfect poem. Spring comes, the grass grows by itself. You could spend months just contemplating that, and you could take yourself to the heart of the mystery that we exist in, because it's a mystery. All the people who say they know. Oh dear, well, how could they possibly know? And I live there. I live in the mystery of it.
In that process, you also seem like someone who has been a really strong truth seeker and a truth teller, and you haven't been afraid to speak the truth. And in Overcoming Speechlessness, you begin with a quote from the Buddha: 3 things cannot be hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. And in the book you write, we are lucky to live at a time when all lies will be exposed, along with the relief of not having to serve them any longer. What do you see as the central lies of our time that we need to free ourselves from?
Aren't you happy about WikiLeaks? I wrote a book called We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. And the first section of that, I think is the first section, talks about this realization that just came, that we live in this time of enlightenment. We are living in a time when nothing will be left unknown, really. I mean, nothing that we need to know. And so when WikiLeaks happened, I felt that this was exactly, but there was no way I could know how it would happen, just that it would happen, because I believe so strongly that the human psyche longs to know what is real. And as a country and as a culture, we have been immersed in so much falsehood and myth and distortion. So it's hard to know, who we are or what to do. But if we get to the root of some of the lies, I think we have a chance. But if we never know, how things started, who started them, who did what, how, when, it's going to be almost impossible even to keep a healthy body, because our bodies are going. We need to know why. I remember in another one of those essays, I'm talking about plutonium. And at the time that I was writing that essay, Dr. Helen Caldicott, was, running all over the planet trying to talk to people about nuclear treachery. I mean, just the disasters that were possible, and being largely ignored. And she's such a warrior. But now we are beginning to see how people like Dr. Caldicott are on the planet to alert us to things, and we have to pay attention. So all of this is happening, all of this, and what is not listened to is experienced in other ways, as we see in what is happening in Japan. You are going to listen. We are going to listen. We will have to. We are going to see. We will have to. We're going to know. We will have to. And it's a very good thing. You know, it's very good. So take your vitamins, you know, do your exercises, do your yoga, you know, learn how to really grow your food, which I'm sure most of you are already doing. But, you know, it's that time. We're living in it.
You had written about the nuclear madness back in the early 80s, I think. And you also stress on your blog, you have a new blog, and maybe you want to say a little bit about that, but you stress our need to exhibit gratitude and respect for the limits of the planet Mother, and that the world is in a dire hour of need, and we may have ruined our nest. And in Overcoming Speechlessness, you mentioned that we're in need of a dialogue to save the planet. So who would be at such a dialogue, and who would be excluded?
Nobody's excluded.
Nobody.
No, I mean, you could exclude yourself, but then you'd be, you know, probably end up sitting on top of something that's caving in. No, when I talk to people, and I talk, you know, or write, I always say, you have to have a circle. You have to have, like, you know, the old, we used to call them affinity groups, but you have to have people that you trust, that you gather together with, and you discuss, you know, what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you would prefer to have happen, and how you can, you know, make changes, however you make them. And never feel that small changes don't matter. They matter a lot. And also the transformation that happens internally is really the most powerful, because without that, you know, you are much more afraid. I mean, humans tend to be much more fearful the less work they've done on themselves, because they don't know what to expect in a confrontation, you know, in a crisis. There's a feeling of, you know, what to do, and that may always be true. But if you work on yourself and understand who you are, it's more likely that a crisis will not throw you completely, that you will have some kind of ballast to steady yourself.
I wanted to get back to your writing a little bit. I've been reading your recent book of Conversations, The World Has Changed, and it offers a fascinating historical overview of your work. In a 1973 interview, you talked about how Black women writers were basically ignored. And then in 1976, you started and joined a group called The Sisterhood with Toni Morrison, Ntozake Shange, and June Jordan. And by the following decade, you, along with many now famous African-American women, had really transformed American literature. You really created a renaissance in American literature, as well as in the feminist movement. Could you say... Did you have a sense of what you were building then? What was it like to be a part of that movement?
Well, the root of it was that we noticed that in America, the powers that be in the literary world, and a lot of them are in New York, have a way of ranking people. So they, you know, somebody that you never heard of in an office somewhere, you know, on 53rd Street or wherever, gets to say who is in and who's out. And they also get to say things that make people angry with each other. You know, so they will sit there. I mean, you don't know these people. You wouldn't know them if they were sitting right here. And yet they have the power to actually impact your lives and your work and your livelihood and your children and your culture and everything. So as Black women, we decided that we did not wish to be a part of that, and that the way to deal with it was to become friends. And so I had gotten a divorce. I had left a huge limestone house that my husband and I had turned. It was a ruin, and we turned it into a palace. It had 8 fireplaces. Oh, anyway. So I moved out, and I moved into 2 rooms, and this was, June and I were plotting this, and I didn't have anything, I didn't have space for a gathering, but she did because she had a big apartment. But what I had was a big red pot that I had bought, or maybe someone gave it to me. Anyhow, I had this big red pot. So I made a big red pot of gumbo, and I took it over to her place, and that was the beginning of our gatherings. And we didn't have an agenda. We just knew that we wanted to know each other so that if someone wrote something awful, we would know what to think. Because you'd be amazed at how much energy goes into getting upset about something that someone says, that someone else said, and it may have nothing to do with the person. And we would have a wonderful time eating and drinking and laughing and knowing that we were safe from a certain kind of control that had meant so much suffering to the writers who came before us. For instance, Zora Hurston. She was so harmed by slander, all of it untrue, simply because she did not control or have any connection with the newspapers that basically tried to destroy her in print. And if she had had a circle of sisters, watching her back and just being with her and seeing exactly what she was saying and what she was doing, I think she could have been saved a lot of misery.
Thanks. So you've written in many genres: fiction, poetry, short stories, essays. And I'm thinking about something Arundhati Roy said after 9/11. She said the times were too urgent to write fiction, though recently she's returned to fiction writing. And more recently she said that we make a false distinction between fiction and reality, and that when the world is so full of lies that perhaps poetry is the only truth we have. Is this true in your case? Does the political context shape the kind of work that you produce? How do you decide what genre you'll use in your writing? And do you think that fiction and poetry may be closer to the truth?
I think fiction is an excellent way to tell the deepest truth, because actually people need a distance from the reality. Sometimes it's just too much. And even when I have written things as fiction, I've had people tell me that they could not bear them. And I have to say that my first novel, The Third Life of Grange Copeland, is so difficult that I can't reread it myself, even though it's fiction. So I think what happens with many of us, and I know with myself, is that I will just wait. I'm so lucky that I don't have, I'm never in competition with anybody else. I'm too busy. I feel like I have to wait until I understand what the thing is, whatever this story, this poem. I can't really, move away from what it needs, in me. If it needs, for instance, if a poem is trying to be born, and I'm in the city, and the poem is not a city poem, I have to wait until I go to the country, until I can be where that poem prefers to be born. And the same is true with writing long novels. I have to give myself a year or two, and it means finding the money to live on for a year or two. And especially in the old days, that was quite a challenge.
Poetry is not a luxury.
Poetry is not a luxury. However, now I find that poetry is so much the right expression for revolution that I've really been inspired by the uprisings and revolts around the world, and writing poetry much more, even before they started, because in me this is rising. In me, just like, spring coming and the grass grows by itself, well, actually in the poet, the poem rises and it grows and it's there by itself. And there's this wonderful feeling of being interactive with life, with humanity, of course, but also with the other animals of the planet. and with trees and everything that's here being actually one with that, and writing out that feeling.
You have talked about the colonization of women's sexuality as part of the colonization of the spirit. And in The Color Purple and some of your other works, you celebrate lesbian sexuality, bisexuality. Why is sexual freedom so essential to our freedom as human beings?
Because it's in sexuality that you really find out who you are. And it's such a teacher. I mean, have you ever, anybody in here, have you ever had any sexual experience in which you learned nothing? It is such a great teacher. It is such a great teacher, and I think we have to pay much more attention to it as a teacher. It has been, ripped off and taken over into the corner and made into this thing. But basically, it's just an amazing teacher. I was explaining to someone who came, there was a British interviewer last week, and he was trying to ferret out all my relationships, And I was explaining to him, well, yeah, I've had all kinds of relationships, and I loved all of them, and still love the people and everything. But I was saying that actually, one of the things that's a challenge is that lesbians often want you to be a lesbian. Bisexual people want you to be bisexual. Straight people want you to be straight. And I am just curious. The acceptance of a box of any kind, I just have never been able to deal with. So, speaking of people who are, boxes and all that, I wrote a piece on my blog. I love blogging. I love it. I was so surprised. I didn't think I would like it because for some reason the word blog is so obnoxious. And I actually thought it made me think of snot. I really like it. I like it because it's free. I like it because, you just do it directly. And so on the blog, there's a piece called From Grandmother's Horse, and it's about Julian Assange because when I looked on the internet news one day, I saw this man who could have come straight out of, Georgia in the 40s or 50s, And he was basically saying that we should lynch Julian. This is what he was saying. He smoothed it out a little bit, but for somebody from the South, you get it. Here's somebody who is saying, if you bring Julian here handcuffed, what should happen is someone should shoot him. This is what he was basically saying. So this was really very annoying. So if you are interested, do read that piece, because I think another thing that we need to do is we need to speak up in any way that we can for the people who are risking their lives to bring us, information and knowledge. Because this is what moves us forward. So anyhow, I wrote this poem many years ago, but this is for Julian, and it's called Be Nobody's Darling. And part of the reason it fits him is because he's not, he has some contradictions, some fairly serious contradictions. And I'm saying that so have we all. Pretty much, we have some really serious contradictions, and we need to acknowledge and, go from there. So this is Be Nobody's Darling. Be nobody's darling. Be an outcast. Take the contradictions of your life and wrap around you like a shawl, to parry stones, to keep you warm. Watch the people succumb to madness with ample cheer. Let them look askance at you, and you askance reply. Be an outcast. Be pleased to walk alone, uncool, or line the crowded riverbeds with other impetuous fools. Make a merry gathering on the bank where thousands perished for brave, hurt words they said, but be nobody's darling. Be an outcast, qualified to live among your dead. You're welcome.
So over the years, you've been involved in many global solidarity movements. You've been to Cuba, support for the Sandinistas, the anti-apartheid struggle. You've worked with indigenous groups, including the Maori, and here in the U.S. You've made connections across the globe in the struggle for justice. You've met with Fidel Castro, Aung San Suu Kyi.
Not Aung San Suu Kyi.
No?
Fidel, though.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I just went and stood in front of her house because they wouldn't let me get any.
Oh, so you didn't meet her. And the Dalai Lama.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So what has been your process of recognizing the interconnections between these movements, these struggles for justice? And are there key lessons you've learned in your travels and meeting with many of these people?
There has to be dancing. And in the case of the Dalai Lama, there has to be really deep thought. In other words, you know, I think I'm following joy. In fact, I'm writing a book called The World Will Follow Joy, but I think I'm just following joy. Because it's not as if, in fact, I was explaining this to somebody. When I met the Cubans for the first time, some Cuban people, I was 19, maybe, and I was in Helsinki. And I was at the World Youth Festival, and the Cubans, they had just had their revolution, and they were just on fire. And they had already decided that they would have none of this stuff about the stage and the audience. They decided that we're all together. And so to demonstrate that to us at this huge gathering in Helsinki, they talked about the revolution, but then they started singing and dancing, and they demanded that everybody in the huge auditorium, as big as this at least, join the line of conga dancing, that then left the theater and went out into the streets of Helsinki, and I tell you, those Finns didn't know what was happening. But actually, I learned from dancing with them a lot. The Finnish youth, who rarely let me sit down, they were good dancers. But anyway, they didn't know what to make of the Cubans. And so, but there we were, in this northern place, doing this wonderful dance, being completely spontaneous and happy, unlike the Russians, for instance. This is where I really understood that you have your Russian communists, and then you have your Cuban communists. And if our government had had any kind of heart, the things we could have learned from Cuba. You think we learned a lot in sexuality, but I'm telling you, we could learn so much more about revolution. As a matter of fact, was it last night before last? There was a film that I introduced in Berkeley called Maestra, Teacher, and it's about the 1961 literacy campaign in Cuba, and how hundreds and thousands of young people went out into the countryside to teach the people to read and write. And it's just, if you have a chance, try to see this. It's so moving. Because now, of course, Cuba has one of the highest rates of literacy on the planet. And there's just this sense in a true revolution that is fueled mostly by love and compassion, of actually bringing to people and giving to people, you know, yourself, giving them something of yourself and something that will make their lives larger and happier. So, you know, I had been, when I finally was able to get some money together and I could choose between, when I was 21, I think, I could choose between going to Paris. I loved French. This was before I went to Paris. I instead went to Mississippi, and it was a similar kind of feeling, you know, to go to Mississippi. I didn't go to Georgia because my parents would have been afraid for me. But I went to Mississippi, and I was able to register voters, you know, people who were not permitted to vote. I was able to take depositions from people just like my parents, just exactly sharecroppers and farmers, just like my parents, who had been thrown off the plantations because they had tried to vote. And this sense of having something to give. I mean, one of the beauties of having an education, for instance, is that you always have something to give. Always. I mean, your parents have given you this gift. Often we just don't even think about it as a gift, but it really is. It is a gift, and you will always have something that you can share with someone on the planet. And the doing of that is so satisfying. You know, it just gets more satisfying the more you do it. You know, the more you use that, the better it gets for you.
And you went to Gaza also in 2009 and kind of shared your presence with the people and wrote a really powerful witness. Can you tell us what you saw there? And what the trip was?
Well, I was with Code Pink and some people who probably were not Code Pinkers, but were, you know, like fellow travelers. Wonderful, soulful people. And I was mostly quiet the whole time because I wanted to just observe, just witness. And, you know, driving in on a bus, we saw that so much of the you know, everything had been bombed. I mean, the police station, which had had hundreds of young men, you know, so many of the people are young in Gaza. And they just flattened it. They just dropped a bomb on the police station. There were hundreds of young men in there. They had bombed the ministries, all the offices of the ministries. They had bombed the hospitals. You know, they had bombed the water supply, the sewage plant. They had bombed, you know, innumerable houses and other buildings. And one day we went to just look at, you know, where they had made a concentration of bombing. And what they did was they bombed everything, and then they took, you know, those caterpillar things, the bulldozers, and then they crushed everything that they bombed, so that you couldn't, you know, you couldn't tell that hardly that anybody had been there. And I was able to find one piece of tile about as big as my hand, beautiful tile that told the story of somebody's kitchen or bathroom that had just been obliterated. And there were all these elderly people who, you know, someone had given them some tents, and they were, you know, in shock, and there was nothing in the tents anyway, and they were just sitting, some of them just sitting out on the ground. And I'd never seen so many, you know, old people left homeless and after, you know, a slaughter and bombardment. And this was very difficult. It was very difficult to see and very difficult to know what to do. But as a writer and as a witness, part of what is my task is to be there and to bring that back so that you can see and feel that too, and think about yourself. Think about your children, being, I was thinking if you're bombed when you're in the hospital, what are you to make of that? The hospital is supposed to be a place where you heal, where you rest. If you're bombed when you're in your schoolyard, if you're little kids running around, what is this doing? Who do these people be, that you terrorize? So it seems to me that what our policies really mean is that we are creating terrorists every second. We just keep making them. We're creating all the terrorists that we would ever want to run from. And it's not even hard to see why. If you abuse people, they hurt. If you take somebody's parent from them when they are, standing right there, if you humiliate people. I remember when I was growing up in Georgia, white people, the way I knew that they were different was that whenever they appeared, black people turned to stone, basically. Every movement was artificial, and the feeling was of deep chilliness. And this is, it's very real. We live in the same world, and there is ultimately no way that you can keep people separate. I mean, they tried it, in the South for all those hundreds of years, and it didn't work, And when you look at the people of the South, especially among people of color, you see how it didn't work. There's a reason why people are different colors. Literally different colors, because their laws didn't work. I mean, the laws were actually there to protect them, but they broke them constantly.
You draw a really powerful connection between the civil rights movement and the struggle in Palestine. And you wrote this beautiful passage called Rachel's Parents, Cindy and Craig. Would you read that to our community?
Yes. This is while we're on the bus. We're going through Sinai. And I'm noticing, among other things, that the Bedouins have been pretty much destroyed also by the Israelis, that they have just taken, their land and, their mobility. They're beggars, basically, by the side of the trail. And all of this should remind us of our history here and what was done to the Native people. It's just the same. It's the same story in just a different time. I came out of this reverie to hear the story of Cindy and Craig Corrie, the parents of Rachel Corrie, who were traveling with us. Rachel Corrie was murdered when she tried to stop an Israeli tank from demolishing a Palestinian house. I was struck by her parents' beauty and dignity. Cindy's face radiated resolve and kindness. Craig's a study in acceptance, humility, incredible strength, and perseverance. Rachel had been working in Palestine and witnessed the ruthlessness of the deliberate destruction of Palestinian homes by the Israeli army, most surrounded by gardens or small orchards of orange and olive trees, which the army consistently uprooted. No doubt believing that the sight of a young American woman in a brightly colored jumpsuit would stop the soldier in the tank, she placed herself between the home of her Palestinian friends and the tank. It rolled over her, crushing her body and breaking her back. The Corries spoke of their continued friendship with the family who had lived in that house. Now, I want to just make a comment here. In this edition of Overcoming Speechlessness, I said, they thought maybe the sight of a young Jewish woman in a jumpsuit, because I assumed that, this is terrible, but I assumed that Rachel was Jewish. And I think I assumed that because in the South, the white people who were usually on our side were Jewish. It was so amazing. But I have been corrected.
But many of the women who were also on the trip with you were Jewish women. You may have heard our Olympia Food Co-op was the first co-op in the nation to boycott Israeli products.
Yes.
And also last spring, the students at the Evergreen State College voted overwhelmingly to divest from companies that profit off the occupation. And you've been an outspoken supporter of the growing international movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. Could you read this statement that you wrote?
Yes. And I'd like to preface this, though, by saying that I had an event that really drove home to me something that is important to share with you, which is that boycotts, like everything else, need to be done with soulfulness. You really need to have your heart in it. And so what happened to me was I was trying to buy some shoes, and I went to a shoe place that I really like and was trying on these gorgeous sandals. And the woman said, well, because she was a step ahead of me on this, she said, well, you know, they're made in Israel. And I couldn't buy them, and I ended up buying some other sandals. But actually what happened in the moment of knowing I couldn't buy the sandals was a bonding that had earlier happened between me and this Palestinian woman who had been kept in solitary confinement for 8 years in an Israeli prison. And I couldn't get over thinking that maybe they make her make shoes there. And that if they make her make shoes, and I never thought about any of the leaders in Israel, in the government. I didn't think about any of them. I thought about this woman, and that my bonding around this issue was with her. And you know, later I discovered that there are so many prisoners, and they're treated so badly. I mean, they're buried, some of them are buried in these grave-like boxes and left there, you know, naked. They're tortured, and some of them have just been there for years. And so it is, you know, and it also brought to mind, from our struggle, how Rosa Parks, when she made her statement by not giving up her seat, and then that mushroomed into the Montgomery bus boycott. What happened to us as younger African American people of color was that we felt an immense amount of love. We felt real love. We felt that the people, the adults, you know, we're adults mostly, that the adults really had a handle on things, and that they were trying with all their might to change apartheid in America so that we would have a chance. So this infused our movement with just the most incredible soulfulness, because in my experience, without soulfulness, you don't transform. You kind of, you know, translate. I mean, it's kind of some kind of movement, but it's not really an internal shift that stays with you. So anyway, so this is after the Israeli paratroopers, or whatever they call them, had shot the boat, shot the people who were on the boat. And you know, even while it was happening, I knew that they were going to make this incredible spin so that it would seem like the people on the boat somehow had attacked the helicopter. I knew it. I mean, this is what you learn in America. You know, that they can put a spin on anything, and you won't do anything. You just sit there and accept the most ridiculous tale. It would be fun, were it not tragic, to compare the various ways the Israeli government and our media will attempt to blame the victims of this unconscionable attack for their own imprisonment, wounds, and deaths. So what to do? Rosa Parks sat down in the front of the bus. Martin Luther King followed her act of courage with many of his own. And using his ringing, compassionate voice, he aroused the people of Montgomery, Alabama, to commit to a sustained boycott of the bus company, a company that refused to allow people of color to sit in the front of the bus, even if it was empty. It is time for us, en masse, to show up in front of our conscience and sit down in the front of the only bus we have, our lives. What would that look like, be like today in this situation between Palestine and Israel? This impasse that has dragged on for decades, this, quote, conflict that would have ended in a week if humanity as a whole had acted in defense of justice everywhere on the globe, which maybe we're learning. It would look like the granddaughter of Rosa Parks, the grandson of Martin Luther King. It would look like spending our money only where we can spend our lives in peace and happiness, freely sharing whatever we have with our friends. It would be to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, against Israel to end the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. And by this effort, begin to soothe the pain and attend the sorrows of a people wrongly treated for generations. This action would also remind Israel that we have seen it lose its way and have called to it, often with love, and we have not been heard. In fact, we have reached out to it only to encounter slander, insult, and too frequently bodily harm. Disengage, avoid, and withhold support from whatever abuses, degrades, and humiliates humanity. Oh, sorry. This we can do. We the people who ultimately hold all the power. We do. We the people who must never forget to believe we can win. We the people. It has always been about us. As we watch governments come and go, it always will be.
Before we open it up to the audience, but you were speaking about the power of the people to change the world, and your lifetime of activism has really been a testament to that. Recently on your blog, I read a letter you'd written to Egyptian feminist Nawal Saadawi, and in it you called the Egyptian Revolution the most spectacular demonstration of a leaderless and peaceful revolution the world has ever seen. Here in the U.S., labor unions, state workers drawing inspiration from Egypt, rising up in Wisconsin, and here we had thousands out in our state. What do you think is necessary to broaden this movement here in the United States, and what words of encouragement do you have for activists?
I think we're awake. And we spread the word of our awakening, and we have the means to do that until they figure out a way to take it away. But while we have it, let's do that, and it's happening. I mean, it is now up to us to have faith in our own ability to change the world. And if we don't change it, we lose it. So it's up to us. Thank you. I've been writing, poems, and I just put them on my blog, and out they go, and it's wonderful. And so I was thinking about revolution and how one of the things that would help everything is we have to teach revolutions how to be what they can become. That is one of the things they've tried to do our government has tried to stop by not letting anybody know what's happening in Cuba. Because they know that, revolution is just as infectious as anything else. And then if the world finds out that you can actually have education and food and all of that, why would they want, another car? So it's up to us as artists and as painters and as poets, writers, to help the revolutions, to give them insight about what things they need to do. Like, for instance, if I were ever invited to talk to the people in Egypt, I would say, you have to get this gender thing going right. The treatment of women is one of the reasons that the world distrusts you. And you have to deeply understand that. I mean, even when people don't like women, they don't necessarily want to think that you can stone their mother, or you can give virginity tests to people just because they're protesting. So there's a lot of work. But we can do that. We can actually, start talking with the people who can be talked to about issues like that. Or you can talk to revolutions in the making about how fundamental it is that all the people be taught to read and write. I mean, just simple things that actually in the heat of revolution, usually led by men, they don't think about things like that. How you have to basically be sure that all the people feel that they are part of this movement, and you can't have that if they are disconnected because they don't know how to connect. Anyway, so the other thought that's in this poem is, okay, we want to change the world, but how do you change it enough? I mean, we can all make some change, but if it's not changed enough, it's just going to slip right back into the rut, because as the Buddha taught us so well, habit is the strong suit here among humans. In fact, there was a saying by one of the sages. Someone said, well, when do we reincarnate? What is it going to be? And the sage says to the guy, the monk, well, I hate to tell you that, but probably when you reincarnate, it's just going to be your bad habits. So that is actually a truth, So our job is to help forward movements for change and for growth and for solidarity and for peace in the world, by sharing what we come to know. And this is about that, to change the world enough. To change the world enough, you must cease to be afraid of the poor. We experience your fear as the least pardonable of humiliations. The least pardonable of humiliations. In the past, it has sent us scurrying off, daunted and ashamed, into the shadows. Now, the world ending, the only one all of us have known, we seek the same fresh light you do, the same high place and ample table. The poor always believe there is room enough for all of us. The very rich never seem to have heard of this. In us, there is wisdom of how to share the loaves and fishes, however few. We do this every day. Learn from us, we ask you. We enter now the dreaded location of Earth's reckoning. No longer far off or hidden in books that claim to disclose revelations. It is here. We must walk together without fear. There is no path without us.